Good day. I'm Gary D. Eppler, Colonel of the U.S. Air Force, retired. Spent 26.5 years in the Air Force, primarily in aircraft maintenance, fighters, and later in my career I spent time in the global logistics. I've supported U.S. Space Command and loved every minute of my career. Today we want to give special recognition to the 8th Air Force, and I'll do that later on in my presentation. And this presentation is going to cover 113 years of military aviation history. The United States Air Force became a separate military service on September 18, 1947, with the implementation of the National Security Act of 1947. The Act created the United States Department of Defense, the Army, Marine Corps, Navy, and the newly created Air Force. Prior to 1947, the responsibility for military aviation was divided between the Army for land-based operations and the Navy and Marine Corps for sea-based operations from aircraft carriers and amphibious aircraft. The Army created the first antecedent of the Air Force in August the 1st of 1907, 113 years ago. Let me discuss World War I real quick. In 1917, upon the United States entry into World War I, the first major U.S. aviation combat forces was created when the Air Service was formed as a part of the American Expeditionary Forces. These aviation units, some of which trained in France, provided tactical air support to the U.S. Army in Europe. Concurrent with the creation of the combat forces, the United States Army Aviation Establishment was placed directly under the United States Secretary of War. With the end of the First World War, the Air Service was dissolved, and the Army's Air Service in the United States was largely demobilized. In 1920, the Air Service became a branch of the Army, and in 1926 was renamed the Army Air Corps. The Air Corps began experimenting with some new techniques, including air-to-air refueling and the development of 2 airplanes, first all-metal mono airplanes for bombers and new fighters. Americans became fascinated with aviation during the 1920s and 30s. And this really spurred on the War Department to attempt to try to keep up with them. Such civilian leaders and glamorous civilians like Charles Lindbergh, Howard Hughes, and Amelia Earhart were primarily instigators of the civilian side of the aerospace business at the time. President Roosevelt, however, had become a firm believer in air power, and he had behind him both public opinion and Congress. In 1937, the B-17 Flying Fortress made its first appearance in a feat of navigation impressive for the time. 3 B-17s intercepted an Italian passenger liner, Rex, at sea. Though intended to demonstrate the ability of the Air Corps to defend the nation's coast, the mission also indicated the emerging doctrine within the Air Corps of supremacy of strategic bombing. When mobilization began in 1947, the President was as energetic as anyone in expanding the Air Corps, calling for 50,000 airplanes to be produced every year, with the best being sent to Britain for their war against Germany. The Air Force came of age in World War II. President Roosevelt took the lead, calling were a vastly enlarged Air Force based on long-range strategic bombing. Organizationally, it became largely independent from the Army in 1941, when the Army Air Corps became part of the U.S. Army Air Forces. The newly created Army Air Forces gained equal voice with the Army and Navy on the Chief of Staff and complete autonomy from the Army. The reorganization also eliminated both the Combat Command and the Air Corps as organization in favor of a more streamlined organizational system for decentralization of management of the burgeoning Army Air Forces. The 8th Air Force, the one I mentioned in the introduction, was in London in 1942 and supervised the strategic bombing campaign. U.S. strategic air forces began daylight bombing operations using pre-war doctrine of flying bombers in close formations, relying on their combined defensive firepower to protect them from attacking enemy aircraft rather than being supported by escort fighters. The reason for that is the fighters at the time did not have the range to take them deep into the German war-making machine. American fires took a heavy casualties during the raids on the oil refineries in Ploesti, Romania, and the ball bearing factories in Schweinfurt and Regensburg, Germany. And it was the loss rate of crews and not material that brought about a pullback from the strategic offense in the autumn of 1943. Bomber protection, however, was greatly improved after the introduction of the North American P-51 Mustang fighter in Europe, with its built-in extended range and competitive or superior performance characteristics in comparison to all existing German fighters. Additionally, Allied fighters were also granted free rein in attacking German fighter airfields, both in pre-planned missions as well as when they were returning from escort duties. The major Luftwaffe threat against the Allied bombers were severely diminished by D-Day. In the Pacific theater, the Army Air Corps provided major tactical support to the Southwest Pacific Theater. Pilots invented skip bombing techniques against Japanese ships and claimed the destruction of 11,900 Japanese aircraft and 1.7 million tons of shipping. The first development and sustained implementation by American Air Forces occurred from May of 42 to November of 45, when hundreds of transports flew more than 500,000 tons of supply from bases in India into China in an attempt to support the B-29 basing there in China. The problem was the Himalaya mountains, and that restricted flights in most of the winter time there. The Air Force created the 20th Air Force to employ long-range bomber B-29 Stratofortress bombers in strategic attacks on Japanese cities. The use of forward bases in China was ineffective because of the difficulty in logistically supporting the bases entirely from the air. And there was also the constant threat of the Japanese Army attacking those bases. After the Mariana Islands were captured in mid-1944, provided air bases in the Southwest Pacific that could be supplied by sea. Curtis General LeMay reasoned that Japanese economy, much of which was a cottage industry in the dense urban areas where manufacturing and assembly plants were also located, was particularly vulnerable to area attack and abandoned the inefficient high-altitude precision bombing in favor of low-level incendiary bombing aimed at destroying the large urban areas. On the night of March 9th of 1945, the bombing of Tokyo resulted in the death of over 100,000 people. 66 additional bombing raids led to the death of approximately 350,000 Japanese in those cities on the Japanese mainland. In the same time, the B-29s were also employed, putting mines in the harbors and the sea lanes to offset the Japanese Navy. In August of 1945, the 20th Air Force conducted atomic bomb attacks on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in response to the Japanese rejection of the Potsdam Declaration, which outlined the terms of surrender for Japan. On August 15th, a couple days later, Emperor Hirohito announced the surrender of Japan. Okay, let's pause it there. In November 1945, General Dwight D. Eisenhower became the Army Chief of Staff. One of Eisenhower's first actions was to prepare a definite plan for reorganization of the Army and the Air Force that would be effected without enabling legislation from Congress and would provide the separation of the Air Force from the Army. General Eisenhower agreed on an Air Force organizational structure comprised of Strategic Air Command, Air Defense Command, Tactical Air Command, Air Transport Command, Air Technical Service Command, Air Training Command, Air University, and the Air Force Center. The United States Department of the Air Force was created again in 18 September 1947, which is recognized as its official birthday, and we will be celebrating that in another 10 days. Once the new Air Force was free of the Army domination, it discarded a lot of the old Army organizational structure in lieu of a more decentralized operation, and put a wing commander in charge of bases versus that had some combat flying experience versus a Army wing commander. After World War II, relations between the United States and the Soviet Union began to deteriorate, and the period in history known as the Cold War began. The United States entered an arms race with the Soviet Union, and competition aimed at increasing each nation's influence throughout the world. The U.S. Air Force opened air bases in Europe, later in Japan and South Korea, and in several British overseas territories, including Ascension Island in the South Atlantic. The first test of the U.S. Air Force during the Cold War came in 1948, when communist authorities in East Germany cut off the road and air transportation to West Berlin, which was located in the middle of East Germany. The United States Air Force, along with the Royal Air Force and the Commonwealth Air Forces, supplied the city during the Berlin airlift using C-54 Skymasters. These efforts by these air forces saved the city from starvation and forced the Soviet Union to back down on their blockade. In 1948, the Women's Armed Services Integration Act gave women permanent status in the reserve and regular air forces of the Air Force. On July 8, 1948, Esther Blake became the first woman in the Air Force, enlisting in the first minute of the first hour of the first day that the Air Force was authorized women. Next, during the Korean War, which began in June of 1950, Far East Air Forces were among the first units to respond to the invasion by the North, but quickly lost the main air base in Kempo, South Korea. Later that year, when the Chinese People's Liberation Army attacked in December of 1950, the United States Air Force provided tactical air support and the introduction of the Soviet-made MiG-15 jet fighters caused problems for the B-29s in their bombing of North Korea. But the Air Force countered the MiGs with its new F-86 Sabre jet fighter. Although both air superiority and close air support missions were successful, the lengthy attempt to inflict and intersect the supply lines by air was not as successful and was replaced with a dedicated program of attacks on the capital city of Panmunjom and against the North Korean hydroelectric system. Moving on to the Vietnam War, the first bombing raids against North Vietnam occurred in 1964. The U.S. dropped more bombs in the first part of the war than they dropped in total in World War II, except for heavy damaging the North Vietnamese economy and infrastructure, failed in its political and strategic goals. The U.S. Air Force did, though, play a critical role in defeating the Easter Offensive of 1972. Rapid redeployment of fighters, bombers, and attack aircraft helped the South Vietnamese Army repel the invasion. The air war for the United States ended with the Christmas bombings, and these bombings helped finalize the Paris peace negotiations. The development of significant special operations capability within the Air Force was started after the Vietnam War, which included air commandos, aerial gunships, tactical missions deep inside enemy territories, and a dedicated combat search and rescue mission, which resulted in the development of operational doctrine, units, and equipment. After 1975, the United States Air Force modernized its air forces in the late 70s with the introduction of F-15, A-10, and F-16 fighters and the implementation of realistic training scenarios under the program Red Flag. It also upgraded the equipment and capabilities of the Air Reserve and the National Guard with first-line fighter aircraft. The U.S. Air Force provided attack, airlift, and combat support capability in operations in Grenada in 1983, Libya in 1986, Panama in 1989. Lessons learned from these operations were applied to its force structure and doctrine and became the basis for successful air operations in the 1990s and after September the 11th, 2001. The development of satellite reconnaissance during the Cold War, the extensive use of both tactical and strategic aerial reconnaissance during numerous combat operations, and the nuclear war deterrent role of the United States Air Force resulted in the recognition of space as a possible combat arena. An emphasis on aerospace operations and doctrine grew in the 1980s. Missile warning and space operations were combined to form the Air Force Space Command in 1982. In 1991, Operation Desert Storm provided emphasis that the ground forces could rely on those reconnaissance assets for very timely intel. The creation of the internet and the universality of combat technology as a basic warfighting tool resulted in the priority development of cyber warfare techniques and defenses by the United States Air Force. The U.S. Air Force provided the bulk of coalition air power during the Gulf War in 1991, flying alongside aircraft of the United States Navy. The F-117 Nighthawk stealth fighter capabilities were shown on the first night of the air war when it was able to bomb central Baghdad and avoid the sophisticated Iraqi air defenses. In 1996 and 1998, the U.S. Air Force bombed military and chemical targets in Iraq. Moving on to the Bosnia and Kosovo, the United States Air Force led the NATO action in Bosnia with no-fly zones in 1993 to 96 and in 95 with airstrikes against the Bosnian Serbs. This was the first time that U.S. aircraft took part in a military action as a part of a NATO mission. In 1999, the Air Force led NATO airstrikes against the Serbs during the Kosovo War. Moving on to the War on Terror. In 2001, the Air Force deployed against Taliban forces in Afghanistan. Operating from Diego Garcia, B-52 Stratofortresses and B-1 Lancer bombers attacked Taliban positions. The Air Force deployed Daisy Cutter bombs dropped from C-130 cargo airplanes for the first time since the Vietnam War. During this conflict, the Air Force opened up bases in Central Asia for the first time. The Air Force was deployed in 2003 during the invasion of Iraq. Air Force aircraft were used to provide support to coalition Iraqi forces in major operations to eliminate insurgent centers, activity, and supply in the north and west Iraq. Operations in both Afghanistan and Iraq demonstrated the effective utility of a new weapon system called the Unmanned Aerial Vehicles, i.e. drones. It was a most prominent in one, which was the MQ-1. The Air Force still maintains a combined air and space operations center in Qatar to direct the air combat operations and predator actions. In March of 2011, Air Force jets bombed military targets in Libya as part of the international effort to enforce the United Nations resolution that imposed a no-fly zone over the country. That was a successful mission, and Gaddafi was removed from power. In the summer of 2014, President Obama announced the return of U.S. Air Forces to Iraq, with permission was later granted for U.S. airstrikes. It was conditioned that the types of airplanes and the locations not be announced in an attempt to protect the countries from which they were based. So from the 1910s on, today the Air Force is the largest, most capable, and most technologically Air Force in the world, with about 5,300 manned aircraft in service. However, those 5,300 aircraft have an average age of 29.2 years. Some of the bombers and tankers are almost 60 years old. Think about that sometime. approximately 156 combat air vehicles, 2,130 air-launched cruise missiles, and 400 intercontinental nuclear ballistic missiles. The Air Force has a little over 300,000 people on active duty, 74,000 in the reserves, and 106,000 in the Guard. The Air Force has had the oldest and most outdated fleet ever. Tactical Air Force purchases were put off during the 1990s and most of the 2000 through 2010. The Air Force on 29 February of 2008 announced one of the largest acquisition programs to replace some of the tankers that were in the 60-year age group with a new tanker fleet. Those aircraft still have not been fully operational yet. There was a nuclear, couple of nuclear bomb incidents during the 2007 and 2008, resulting in a substantial number of Air Force general officers and colonels have been identified as potentially subject to disciplinary actions ranging from removal from command to letters of reprimand. And the resignation of the United States Secretary of Air Force Mike Wynn and the United States Chief of Staff Mike Mosley. In the United States Air Force, leading the formation of the National Commission on the Structure of the Air Force to resolve the proper balance between the reserves and the active duty. I'd just like to make one more comment about the new Space Command, which is just being authorized and just starting out. They will be a couple, 3 years to get that process going. I worked on some of that paperwork and concept in the 1970s unofficially, and they have got a major undertaking to bring up the U.S. Space Command, a separate branch of the service altogether. This concludes my briefing. The information was provided by the Air Force Air University Training Command in Maxwell Air Force Base.
Gary, I want to thank you very, very much. Colonel Eppler, we appreciate that you're coming here today. This will be shown to all the Air Force JROTC units in the county.
Good.
And hopefully beyond. My name is Don Weaver. I'm the coordinator for Veterans Back to Class. And again, Gary, thank you very much. Your expertise, your experience meant a lot for you to come in today and do this. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you, sir.